And I want to thank all of you for the great privilege of coming here to Gannon University the first time I've been here. I want to thank your president, Dr. Taylor, Dr. Eric Dart, Father Kostecki. I want to thank in a special way Tom and Mary Loftus for generously underwriting this lecture. Wonderful opportunity. And I would also say how privileged I am to have Bishop Persico and Bishop Troutman both in attendance. Makes me just a little nervous, but I will get over it. And I'm looking forward to the opportunity of sharing a few reflections now that we have passed the 5th anniversary of Pope Francis's pontificate. We're at one of those wonderful markers for kind of taking stock about what this pontificate is about. I have a wonderful introduction written. Unfortunately, Professor Dart anticipated almost to a word all of it in his wonderful words there, straight to the Vatican II text that I'm leading my lecture with. So now it's going to look like I plagiarized him, and I'm not quite sure what to do with that. But it's too late to rewrite it. So we are now over half a century removed from the close of the most momentous event in modern Catholicism, the Second Vatican Council. And even at the distance of 5 decades, that council continues to challenge contemporary Catholicism. Christ summons the church, the council wrote, as she goes her pilgrim way to that continual reformation of which she always has need. In asserting the church's pilgrim nature, the bishops at the council quietly distanced themselves from an earlier understanding of the church as a societas perfecta, a perfect society. Right away, I lose my place. That understanding of the church was one in which the church hovered in supreme confidence and certitude far above worldly concerns. Yet, as the council reminded us, as pilgrim, the church does not wander aimlessly. It is led by the Spirit on a long journey toward its final destination when the council writes it will finally achieve its consummation at the end of history. Consequently, as a people on the way, as a pilgrim church that has not yet reached its destination, the work of ecclesial reform and renewal cannot be merely an occasional undertaking. The work of ecclesial reform and renewal cannot be occasional. It cannot be simply an exercise in regular or periodic maintenance, as when one occasionally has to adjust the hands of a clock that runs too fast or too slow. To be a pilgrim church is to be always about the work of reform. Most church leaders are aware of this, even as they may disagree about what kind of reform is required. For his part, Pope Francis was certainly elected by the College of Cardinals on a platform of reform. But it was a platform of reform largely focused on the Roman Curia. This had been precipitated by a series of financial scandals associated with the Vatican in the months leading up to the conclave. And Jorge Bergoglio was elected as a Vatican outsider, not primarily because he was from the global south or because he was a Jesuit, but because he had no history as a Vatican bureaucrat or a career diplomat. 5 years later, it is now clear that Pope Francis is committed to a far broader program of church reform than many of his electors had imagined. Pope Francis's commitment to church reform requires careful consideration. He is not interested in reform for reform's sake. He believes that church reform must always be oriented toward the Council's call to become more fully a missionary church. In his July 2013 address, but a few months after his election, an address given to the coordinating committee of Selam during his visit to Brazil, he said this: "The change of structures from obsolete ones to new ones will not be the result of reviewing an organizational flow chart, which would lead to a static reorganization. Rather, it will result from the very dynamics of mission. What makes obsolete structures pass away, what leads to a change of heart in Christians, is precisely a missionary spirit. He further develops this in the document that remains really the Magna Carta of his pontificate, the Evangelii Gaudium. I dream of a missionary option. That is, a missionary impulse capable of transforming everything, so that the church's customs, ways of doing things, times and schedules, language and structures can be suitably channeled for the evangelization of today's world, rather than for her self-preservation. The renewal of structures demanded by pastoral conversion can only be understood in this light, as part of an effort to make them more missionary-oriented, to make ordinary pastoral activity on every level more inclusive and open, to inspire in pastoral workers a constant desire to go forth, and in this way to elicit a positive response from all those whom Jesus summons to friendship with himself. This commitment to a program of ecclesial reform in service of the church's mission has led the Pope to criticize a more bureaucratic way of dealing with pastoral issues. He complained in Evangelii Gaudium that, quote, the church sometimes has locked itself up in small things, in small-minded rules, unquote. Indeed, as I will argue in a few moments, this lack of interest in bureaucratic matters may explain why he has had relatively modest success in the reform of the Curia. In any event, to adequately grasp the contours of Pope Francis's reformist vision, I propose that we look at three underlying principles, each of which is grounded in the teaching of the Council, yet each of which has been developed and expanded by Pope Francis. The first theological principle undergirding Pope Francis's reformist vision of the Church is the principle of synodality. In the fall of 2015, while the Extraordinary Synod on the Family was still in progress, Pope Francis gave what I believe was one of the most ecclesiologically significant speeches of his pontificate. The occasion was the 50th anniversary of the creation of the Synod of Bishops by his predecessor, Pope Paul VI. In that speech, he noted that the word synod comes from the Greek synodos, which could be rendered traveling on a journey together. Quote, it is precisely on this path of synodality, the Pope said, where we find the pathway that God expects from the church of the third millennium. A church committed to walking together, he insisted, is a church that has to resist the neo-scholastic separation of the people of God into two separate churches, the ecclesia docens, or teaching church, and the ecclesia decens, or learning church. A synodal church, he insisted, must be whole and entire, a listening church. Synodality, Pope Francis contends, must be enacted at every level of church life. It must be reflected in local, parish, and diocesan councils, in diocesan synods, and provincial gatherings. His commitment to synodality has deep roots in the teaching of Vatican II. In the Council's consideration of a theology of tradition, for example, in Dei Verbum, Article 8, the Council insisted that tradition grows and develops not only through the teaching of the Pope and bishops, but as well through the spiritual experience and insight of ordinary believers. The Council also taught in Lumen Gentium 12 that every Christian receives at baptism a supernatural instinct for the faith, the sensus fidei, that allowed each Christian to receive God's word, to penetrate its meaning more deeply, and to apply it more fully in their lives. Unfortunately, relatively little was said about this conciliar notion of the sense of the faithful in the decades immediately following the Council. I suspect this was due in no small part to the way in which the term was ensnared in one of the most infamous controversies that has haunted the post-conciliar church, namely the controversies associated with Pope Paul VI's encyclical Humanae Vitae. Please recall that Pope Paul VI had asked the Council not to consider the vexing question of the licéity of artificial birth regulation. The Pope promised to reconstitute a special commission that in fact had first been created by Pope St. John the 23rd. Initially, the commission was comprised of bishops and theologians, but the Pope would eventually appoint 3 married couples to the commission as well. Those couples were involved in important lay organizations like the Christian Family Movement, and they brought to the commission extensive testimony regarding the burdens that then current church teaching represented for many couples. The commission ultimately sent the Pope a report requesting that he relax the church's teaching on this question. To many, the work of the commission was an important initial exemplification of the Council's teaching on the need to listen to the sense of the faithful. However, as is well known and is proper to his ministry, the Pope chose to reject the Commission's recommendation and reasserted the Church's traditional teaching in his latest and last encyclical, Humanae Vitae. Now, this is not an occasion for me to wade into the controversy around that. There are very serious and committed Catholics who consider this one of the most important and prophetic teachings of the Church. There are others who consider it problematic. I'm addressing the question here not as a moral theologian, but as an ecclesiologist. For the fact of the matter is that whatever one makes of that particular controversy, the fact that the commission was created in a way as a first effort to consult the faithful, the controversies associated with it, I think in some ways tainted the theological concept of the sense of the faithful. And after that, it became very difficult for people to appeal to it because it was often used in very polarized arguments and was often susceptible to a kind of a reduction to Gallup polls and what they would yield. All right? But it's regrettable, nevertheless, because from that period on, really on up to the time of Pope Francis, the sensus fidei did not play a significant role in ecclesiastical teaching. The careful avoidance of that teaching, however understandable it might be, has come to a dramatic end with the election of Pope Francis. The Church's first Jesuit pope has consistently encouraged church leaders to take seriously the Council's teaching on the sense of the faithful. And so in Evangelii Gaudium, he writes, as part of his mysterious love for humanity, God furnishes the totality of the faithful with an instinct of faith, sensus fidei, which helps them to discern what is truly of God. The presence of the Spirit gives Christians a certain connaturality with divine realities and a wisdom which enables them to grasp those realities intuitively, even when they lack the wherewithal to give them precise expression. Francis' affirmation of this long-neglected conciliar teaching is certainly welcome, But even more so is the attention he has given to developing practices of consultation that would bring to light the wisdom of the ordinary Christian faithful. For him, this is essential to becoming a synodal church. And here again, the council had already recommended this. The council itself had spoken of the need to create consultative structures. And so, for example, in Lumen Gentium, the dogmatic constitution on the church, the council wrote, "They, the laity, should disclose their needs and desires to the pastors with that liberty and confidence which befits children of God and brothers and sisters in Christ. To the extent of their knowledge, competence, or authority, the laity are entitled, and indeed sometimes duty-bound, to express their opinion on matters which concern the good of the church. Should the occasion arise, this should be done through the institutions established by the church for that purpose, and always with truth, courage, and prudence, and with reverence and charity towards those who, by reason of their office, represent the person of Christ." Unfortunately, while the revised Code of Canon Law, promulgated in 1983, did indeed allow for a wide range of consultative structures, some of which I fear have not been as well implemented as they might, the fact of the matter is that virtually all of those consultative structures were strictly optional, and many of them have been employed to little practical effect. Pope Francis has acknowledged this difficulty. In a much-discussed interview, the Pope spoke of the consistories of cardinals and the synod of bishops as missed opportunities for consultation. "We must give them a less rigid form," he contended. "I do not want token consultation, but real consultations." And in Evangelii Gaudium, he challenged the bishops to broaden their practice of consultation. The bishop, he says, will have to encourage and develop the means of participation proposed in the Code of Canon Law and other forms of pastoral dialogue out of a desire to listen to everyone and not simply to those who would tell him what he would like to hear. What is particularly welcome in this text is the recognition that consultation is more than gathering together safe voices that function as little more than an ecclesiastical echo chamber. Let me be clear. I suspect that most bishops and pastors, and for that matter, most provincials, theology department chairs, deans and university presidents, CEOs, all believe they are consultative. And they are, because they seek out the opinions of others. But the Pope rightly insists that authentic consultation, authentic ecclesial consultation in a synodal church, a consultation that aspires to be more than a pragmatic public relations maneuver, must attend to a wide range of voices. The second principle of reform, evident in this remarkable pontificate, is what we might call the principle of subsidiarity. This principle first appeared in Catholic theology in the field of social ethics, where it affirmed that social issues are best dealt with at the local level. A higher authority may intervene, but only when an issue could not be resolved at the local level or when the welfare of the larger body was at stake. Pope Pius XII extended the principle's field of application when he observed in 1946 that this principle was valid also for the life of the church, without prejudice to its hierarchical structure. The principle was not explicitly mentioned in the documents of Vatican II, but several commentators believe it is implicit in a number of texts and passages. For example, in the Council's teaching on the liturgy in Sacrosanctum Concilium, the Council granted to episcopal conferences primary authority over vernacular liturgical translations and regional liturgical adaptations. However, in the successive pontificates of Pope St. John Paul II and Benedict XVI, it was considered inappropriate to apply the principle of subsidiarity to the life of the Church. They contended that the Church is no mere sociological reality, but a spiritual communion, and therefore not subject to the sociological rules that apply to other secular institutions. In fact, one could make the argument that under those two pontificates, we have seen enacted a pronounced re-centralization in the Church that moved in a quite different direction from that of the Council. Now, when I say this, I'm always a little bit uncomfortable when I find myself in a position of having to criticize some aspect of one or another pontificate. I think it's important that we don't paint with a broad brush here. I think that every one of the popes since the Second Vatican Council in their own way has contributed to the furthering and the implementation of the Council. But popes, almost out of necessity, are going to be selective. There are going to be certain aspects of the Council's teaching that they will emphasize more than others. There will be others that they might receive with a certain amount of caution. So what I'm suggesting here simply is, without in any way diminishing the tremendous contributions of Pope St. John Paul II and Pope Benedict, on this particular question, I think they were rather cautious about whether, in fact, subsidiarity could be applied to the life of the Church. For example, we saw evidence of this program of re-centralization of church authority under both John Paul II and Benedict in the area of the liturgy. In 2001, the Vatican's Congregation for Divine Worship and the Discipline of the Sacraments issued Liturgiam Authenticum, a document that shifted much of the responsibility for liturgical translations away from episcopal conferences, as the Council had mandated, and back to the Vatican. This revised translation process also would include a line-by-line Vatican assessment of all liturgical translations submitted to it, often resulting in the imposition of thousands of amendments to the submitted translation. Liturgiam Authenticum also called for a much stricter fidelity to the original Latin text. Unfortunately, the price of this stricter fidelity was often a diminishment in the text's intelligibility and prayability. In the English-speaking world, this problematic new procedure yielded the much criticized 2011 English edition of the Roman Missal. Also, in another instance of this, in 2007, Pope Benedict issued Summorum Pontificum, which insisted that local bishops were no longer free to engage in their own pastoral discernment regarding whether there was a legitimate pastoral need to provide for the celebration of the Mass in Latin and celebrated according to the preconciliar Missal. Rather, the motu proprio of Pope Benedict required bishops to make the necessary accommodations whenever and wherever the faithful requested it, however small in number they might be. Many theologians, and not a few bishops, have respectfully challenged this program of centralizing authority as not in keeping with the larger vision of the Council. And in doing so, they have often appealed to the ecclesial application of the principle of subsidiarity. Local churches and their pastoral leaders, the principle would hold, should be granted their proper autonomy. The exercise of higher authority, which may well be legitimate, must be exercised as a means toward preserving both the integrity of the local church and the universal communion of churches. Pope Francis appears to acknowledge the ecclesial application of the principle of subsidiarity, even if he doesn't use the term itself, calling instead for a necessary ecclesial decentralization. In Evangelii Gaudium, the Pope wrote, "Nor do I believe that the papal magisterium should be expected to offer a definitive or complete word on every question which affects the Church and the world. It is not advisable for the Pope to take the place of local bishops in the discernment of every issue which arises in their territory. In this sense, I am conscious of the need to promote a sound decentralization. The commitment to ecclesial subsidiarity and the decentralization of church authority has led the Pope, for example, to give an unprecedented emphasis on the teaching role of regional episcopal conferences. Again, in Evangelii Gaudium, he writes, "The Second Vatican Council stated that, like the ancient patriarchal churches, episcopal conferences are in a position to contribute in many and fruitful ways to the concrete realization of the collegial spirit. Yet this desire has not been fully realized, since a juridical status of episcopal conferences, which would see them as subjects of specific attributions, including genuine doctrinal authority, has not yet been sufficiently elaborated. Excessive centralization, rather than proving helpful, complicates the church's life and her missionary outreach." The high esteem with which Pope Francis holds the teaching ministry of episcopal conferences is reflected in one of the most unprecedented features of his papal documents, namely his habit of frequently citing in his papal documents promulgated by regional episcopal conferences. So, for example, in Amoris Laetitia, he cites regional episcopal conferences 10 times. In his encyclical Laudato Si, on care for our common home, he cites episcopal conferences 20 times. And in his recently released apostolic exhortation, Gaudete et Exultate, he cites episcopal conferences 7 times. A few years ago, a Brazilian bishop disclosed a conversation with Pope Francis in which he claimed that Pope Francis was sympathetic to the pastoral urgency of the current priest shortage, and that he was open to the possibility, in some instances, of ordaining mature married men to the priesthood. But he did not feel it was his responsibility to initiate that. Rather, he felt that a proposal like that should come from not the Pope, but from episcopal conferences themselves. And indeed, more recently, an announcement was made that the Vatican is considering just such a request from the Brazilian bishops regarding the ordination of married men ad experimentum. My point here is not to weigh in on the virtues and shortcomings of ordaining married men to the priesthood. My point here is that he sees this in the light of the principle of subsidiarity, where the request should come from local churches, not be initiated from the top, right? That's the point that I want to focus on here. Interestingly, this commitment to ecclesial subsidiarity may help explain Pope Francis's ambiguous track record to date on curial reform. He is, of course, not the first pope to attempt to reform the curia, since it achieved its modern dicasterial form in the 16th century. At Vatican II, in fact, many of the bishops had been outspoken in their criticism of the curia, none more so than Cardinal Joseph Frings, who gave a famous intervention critical of the curia's abuse of authority. An intervention that was noteworthy for the fact that it was authored by his peritus, or theological advisor, the young German theologian Joseph Ratzinger. The request for curial reform indeed found its way into the council's decree on the office of the bishop, Christus Dominus. Both Pope Paul VI and Pope John Paul II attempted significant curial reforms. Pope Paul VI made a considerable effort to internationalize the curia. He added 5-year renewable terms. He shifted the locus of power away from the Holy Office, now the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, and toward the Secretariat of State. Yet in general, it must be said that none of these reforms has been particularly successful in changing the troubling curial culture that remains an object of concern. Although Pope John Paul II effected further curial reform in his constitution, Pastor Bonus, the fact is that the Polish Pope, with wide geopolitical interests, was relatively uninterested in the mechanics of bureaucratic reform. And many of the reforms that did occur seemed to strengthen the authority of the curia over local bishops. This relative lack of interest in curial reform continued under his successor, Pope Benedict XVI. Pope Francis has certainly made an effort at curial reform. He's created 2 new dicasteries, he's combined several others, yet these changes have fallen short of what many had hoped for. He did create the important Council of Cardinals, now often referred to as the C9, as an independent entity given broad authority to effect necessary curial reform. Yet their work has gone at a much slower pace than many would have anticipated and has been met with substantial resistance within the Vatican. Indeed, a recent spokesperson for the Council of Cardinals has admitted that the C9 is no longer contemplating, as it once was, creating a new constitution on the Curia to replace Pastor Bonus. The Pope has also backed away from the creation of a formal tribunal he had originally proposed to investigate bishops who were complicit in the clerical sexual abuse cover-up. All of this suggests that Pope Francis's own interests appear to lie less in bureaucratic renewal and more in a conversion of the curial culture. For example, he has used his last 2 Christmas addresses to the Curia to scold them for instances of hypocrisy, opportunism, and careerism. The uneven record in curial reform brings us back to Francis's commitment to ecclesial subsidiarity. I think it is quite likely that in the face of substantial resistance to a bureaucratic reform of the Curia, Pope Francis has adopted a different strategy, namely one that would largely circumvent the Curia rather than reform it. This is evident in his decision to create a commission to explore the ordination of women to the diaconate, his convocation of 2 assemblies on the Synod of Bishops to consider issues related to marriage and family, and another upcoming on the youth. These were topics that previous popes would have remanded to a curial office. The Pope has simply moved and redirected the flow of decision-making outside of the Vatican. Vatican journalist Robert Mickens has pointed out how relative to the 2 previous pontificates, the flow of ecclesiastical texts emanating from the Vatican has been reduced to a trickle. This determination to simply circumvent the Curia is reflected in one of the more celebrated Vatican dust-ups of Francis's pontificate. And here a little background may be helpful. One of the most clear differences between Pope Francis and his predecessor, Pope Benedict, and I would emphasize that there is also a great deal that they share in common, not the least of which is a robust Christocentrism. But if one were to focus on some of the clear differences between the two, one of the most obvious concerns their respective attitudes toward the liturgy. Now, in the minds of some, this difference stems from Francis's Jesuit formation, given the famous yet somewhat unfair attribution of liturgical indifference to the Society of Jesus. Some have wittingly, if unfairly, suggested that the principal liturgical maxim of the Jesuits is, after all, first, do no harm. What is clear is that, unlike his predecessor, Pope Francis has little sympathy for the so-called liturgical reform of the Reform. He has left in place his predecessors' generous provisions for the celebration of the extraordinary form of the liturgy, which is to be celebrated in Latin and according to the missal that was in force on the eve of the council. But it's clear he has no real enthusiasm for it. He likewise does not share Pope Benedict's preference for priests celebrating the Mass ad orientem, with facing east and with their back to the people, nor for insisting that the faithful receive the host on the tongue while kneeling. In September of 2017, he issued Magnum Principium, a motu proprio that revised canon law by shifting the authority of liturgical translations away from the Vatican and back to episcopal conferences. It also revised some of the norms for liturgical translation that had been established in that earlier document in 2001. Pope Francis expanded the document, that Liturgiam Authenticum's insistence on liturgical fidelity, to include not only fidelity to the Latin text, which was the emphasis in the 2001 document, but also fidelity to the language in which the text would be translated, and fidelity to the comprehension of the worshiping community. Soon after the publication of the papal document, and here my interest is not so much stirring up dirt in the Vatican as suggesting how I think the ecclesial principle of subsidiarity is working in this pontificate. Soon after the publication of the papal document, the African Cardinal Robert Sarah, the prefect of the Vatican Congregation for Divine Worship, wrote a commentary that appeared to minimize the changes the Pope had called for. His commentary insisted on the continued authority of the earlier document and held that the Pope's revised process for producing liturgical translations left in place the rigorous Vatican involvement in the process. It was at this point that Pope Francis took the surprising step of issuing a public letter to correct Cardinal Sarah's interpretation of Magnum Principium. The Pope insisted that he had, in fact, revised the translation norms established in the earlier document. Moreover, he asserted that Magnum Principium does, in fact, call for a much reduced Vatican oversight of the translation process. For example, he said the worship congregation was not, as Cardinal Sarah had suggested, still authorized to impose extensive translation changes on episcopal conferences. Now, I've described this incident in some detail because it offers further support to my view that Francis has now determined that the best way to reform the Curia is simply to redirect much of what had earlier been the responsibility of the Curia to other ecclesial entities, guided largely by his commitment to ecclesial subsidiarity. The third principle and final principle underlying Pope Francis's reformist vision is what we might call the pastorality of doctrine. Here again, in order to appreciate what Pope Francis is doing, we have to go back to Vatican II. In Pope St. John the 23rd's influential opening address at the council, Gaudet Mater Ecclesia, the Pope offered an unambiguous affirmation of the Church's fidelity to its doctrinal heritage. But he also insisted that fidelity to the Church's tradition means more than simply a rote repetition of doctrines. He said, "The whole world expects a step forward toward a doctrinal penetration and a formation of consciousness in faithful and perfect conformity to authentic doctrine, which, however, should be studied and expounded through the methods of research and through the literary forms of modern thought. The substance of the ancient doctrine of the deposit of faith is one thing, but the way in which it's presented is another." Good Pope John, as he was often called, exhibited an understanding of doctrine quite different from the world of seminary education at the time. Most Latin dogmatic manuals that served as standard texts in seminaries viewed divine revelation in static categories as a collection of free-floating doctrinal propositions, the meaning of which was self-evident. Pope John understood, by contrast, that doctrine is always rooted in particular historical contexts, and it has to be studied, quote, through the methods of research and through the literary forms of modern thought, unquote. Most doctrinal teachings emerged in the Church not as theoretical proposals, but as specific, concrete responses to real church crises or challenges. The appropriate pastoral application of a church doctrine requires that one knows something of the historical and pastoral context in which a teaching first emerged. In addition, as the Pope insisted, the Church must always be open to the possibility that a doctrine may need to be reformulated in ways that better express its deep meaning and which are more conducive to its proper communication in the modern age. This is all Pope John. Pope John then continued in his opening address to offer a critical assessment of the way church teaching authority was at times exercised in the past. He said an emphasis on the vigorous condemnation of error must be replaced by the medicine of mercy and by persuasively demonstrating the truth of church teaching. What the church needed, Pope John contended, was a teaching magisterium that was fundamentally pastoral in character. The church must not be content with offering a mere repetition of doctrinal formulations. What was demanded was a penetration of church doctrine in view of the pressing questions of our time. As one theologian once put it, one of the great pastoral challenges of the church is to resist the temptation to offer really eloquent answers to questions no one's asking. The theologian John O'Brien observes that with Pope John's speech and the work of the council, the pastoral had regained its proper standing as something more than just the application of doctrine, but is the very context from which doctrines emerge and the very condition of the possibility of doctrine, the touchstone for the validity of doctrine, and the always prior and posterior praxis which doctrine at most attempts to sum up, safeguard, and transmit. The council bishops did not renounce the need for church doctrine, but rather they placed church doctrine in the context of a richer theology of the revelation as God's self-communication, an invitation to divine friendship. And although the fullness of divine revelation was communicated in the person of Jesus, the church does not possess a comprehensive and exhaustive grasp of that revelation. Rather, as Dei Verbum 8 reminded us, the pilgrim church is always moving toward the fullness of divine truth. It does not so much possess revelation as it is possessed by it, as it is called to live into divine truth which it receives as gift. The council also recognized that as important as church doctrine was, it ultimately was superseded by a more basic reality, the gospel itself. And that among the church's principal dogmatic teachings there was a hierarchy of truths, as not all church dogmas were equally central to the foundation of the Christian faith. I've spent a lot of time on this point in order to root what Pope Francis is doing in the intuitions and impulses of the council. Pope Francis has breathed new life into another important conciliar teaching. Pope Francis is a doctrinal conservative. We need to make no bones about it. He accepts the necessary role of doctrine in the life of the church, but he also believes that it should not be used as an excuse for suppressing disagreement and doubt. Few, if any, modern popes have spoken so honestly about the positive place of doubt and the dangers of false certitude. In an early interview he gave in the beginning of his papacy, Pope Francis remarked, "If one has the answers to all the questions, that is the proof that God is not with him. It means that he's a false prophet using religion for himself. The great leaders of the people of God, like Moses, have always left room for doubt." Pope Francis has also given renewed emphasis to the council's teaching on the hierarchy of truths. He sees this as a matter of more than ranking doctrines. The council wanted to remind us that doctrine relates us to something more basic, more fundamental, the Christian kerygma. For Francis, too, doctrine is always to be at the service of the fundamental gospel message. This more formal, propositional language in which many rely on in their understanding of doctrine can put doctrine at several degrees of abstraction from the gospel as it is concretely experienced in the life of discipleship. And so Pope Francis says, pastoral ministry in a missionary style is not obsessed with the disjointed transmission of a multitude of doctrines to be insistently imposed. When we adopt a pastoral goal and a missionary style, which would actually reach everyone without exception or exclusion, the message has to concentrate on the essentials, on what is most beautiful, most grand, most appealing, and at the same time most necessary. The message is simplified, he says, while losing none of its depth and truth, and thus it becomes all the more forceful and convincing. Francis consistently relates church doctrine to the core Christian kerygma and situates it within the pastoral life of the church. Now, I bring this third principle up in large part because I think it helps us understand better the persistent fears of some of his critics who have questioned Francis's orthodoxy. As is by now well known, in 2016, 4 senior cardinals sent Pope Francis what might be called a kind of doctrine exam, known officially as a set of dubia or doubts. Their questions were posed as humble requests for clarification. But in fact, the authors seemed bent on testing the Pope's doctrinal orthodoxy. Then, in July of 2017, over 60 conservative scholars and clerics offered an extended filial correction of the Pope's teaching. So what are we to make of this? These critics, in truth, represent a very small but quite vocal group of Catholics who are without a doubt sincere in their faith. But they continue to find solace in the certitudes and clear lines of ecclesiastical authority typical of an earlier time. Their deep convictions regarding the Catholic faith are grounded in a tidy, logically coherent system of truth claims. From within this cramped theological framework, they cannot help but perceive Francis as doctrinally sloppy, whose orthodoxy they assess as an because they assess his orthodoxy in an exclusively propositional register. You see, if you believe that revelation is nothing more than a collection of certain truths that demand unquestioning assent, that's how you're going to assess the authenticity of papal teaching. And if you find that teaching wanting, well, your only recourse is to challenge the Pope's orthodoxy. Francis has not responded to either the dubia or the later fraternal correction, primarily because he does not believe the measure of fidelity to the gospel should be a speculative parsing of historically decontextualized doctrinal propositions. Francis is convinced that an authentic presentation of the gospel must respond to the real questions and concerns that preoccupy people today. He is committed to a presentation of church doctrine that honors the challenges and integrity of each person's faith journey. In his recent homily at the 2018 Chrism Mass, Pope Francis warned against treating truth in an abstract, ideological manner. In his recent apostolic exhortation, Gaudete et Exsultate, he warns of a new form of Gnosticism that is too much in love with abstract ideas and doctrines. He writes, Gnostics do not understand this because they judge others based on their ability to understand the complexity of certain doctrines. They think of the intellect as separate from the flesh, and thus become incapable of touching Christ's suffering flesh in others, locked up as they are in an encyclopedia of abstractions. In the end, by disembodying the mystery, they prefer a God without Christ, a Christ without the church, a church without her people. A healthy and humble use of reason in order to reflect on the theological and moral teaching of the gospel is one thing. It is another to reduce Jesus' teaching to a cold and harsh logic that seeks to dominate everything. What we're witnessing here in those who challenge the Pope's orthodoxy is essentially a clash between two fundamentally different understandings of how to be a faithful Catholic in the contemporary world, and two different understandings of what constitutes the Church's core mission. For some, fidelity is ultimately measured by formal assent to a list of church doctrines. These Catholics believe the Church's mission consists in offering timeless certitudes to a world lost in a sea of relativism. But for others, particularly for those who find Pope Francis's leadership so compelling, fidelity is measured more by the concrete practice of Christian discipleship. For them, the Church should respond to the questions and yearnings of humankind today. That is not to say that the faithfulness to the teachings of the Church is not vital, but the ultimate measure of faithfulness to God's call lies in witnessing to the gospel of mercy and God's boundless love. In my reflections this evening, I've called our attention to the need to interpret this remarkable pontificate through the lens of the Second Vatican Council. Although he is the first post-conciliar pope not to have been present at the council, I am convinced that no pope since Vatican II has so comprehensively grasped the council's reformist vision. Francis is a reformer, but he is wary of simply rearranging ecclesiastical furniture. Structural reform must serve the missionary work of the Church. And so I've argued this evening that Francis's program for ecclesial reform is grounded in three fundamental principles. His commitment to synodality leads him to emphasize the practice of dialogue and the priority of listening to the other, and especially to those who disagree with us. His commitment to subsidiarity has led him to shift the locus of pastoral reform and creativity from the Vatican to local churches. And finally, his commitment to the pastorality of doctrine helps him avoid wielding the language of orthodoxy, heresy, and dissent like a club to silence all disagreement. His sense of reform is entirely in keeping with the Second Vatican Council, which taught that any authentic reform will always consist in an increase of fidelity to the Church's own calling. This Pope is no ideologue, nor can he be pigeonholed in the political categories of liberal or conservative. Francis is a man in love with Christ and committed to Christ's gospel of mercy. As Pope, he is calling the Church, he is indeed calling us to leave behind our bad ecclesial habits of complacency, rigidity, self-righteousness, and a reliance on easy certitude. As a papal reformer, he's exhorting us to undertake whatever church reforms will free us to go unencumbered to the margins and bring the gospel of mercy to a wounded and hungry world. Thank you very much.